My name is Camille Durant. I'm 35 years old, and last weekend I got married in my aunt's backyard, wearing a $150 dress I altered myself. My cousins, the same ones who threw six-figure weddings with drone footage and swan fountains, spent the whole day whispering behind champagne glasses. Camille's really committing to the thrift store aesthetic, one of them muttered. Another posted a selfie at my reception with the caption, DIY bridecore, bless her heart. But I didn't say a word. I just smiled. Because beneath the hem of that simple dress, stitched in gold thread, was the logo of the luxury wedding firm they all used, the one they bragged about, tagged on Instagram, and claimed had changed the game. The one I own. Their weddings paid for my house. My wedding, the one they mocked, reminded me why I started in the first place. And when they saw that logo, they finally understood. But to get to that moment, you need to hear the whole story. I grew up knowing the difference between what looked expensive and what actually cost something. My mother had a gift for making beauty out of almost nothing. Fabric scraps became dresses, jam jars turned into vases, and leftovers were transformed into meals that looked like celebrations. I was her only child, and while we never lacked love, we definitely lacked money. My cousins, on the other hand, floated through childhood like swans across still water, their every movement supported by money, connections, and quiet approval. They were always dressed in coordinated outfits from the latest children's boutiques, with matching shoes and hair bows that somehow never slipped out of place. I watched them from the edge of family gatherings, always feeling like I was in the wrong costume for the wrong play. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment above my mother's small alterations shop. While other kids played with dolls, I learned how to thread a needle, hem a skirt, steam a veil. The smell of pressed silk and warm starch was more familiar to me than perfume. I used to imagine what it would be like to have a wedding like the ones I saw my mom work on, dresses with trains so long they needed to be carried, gowns with names I couldn't pronounce sewn into the labels. We didn't go on vacations. We went to wholesale fabric expos. And while other girls made Pinterest boards of their dream weddings, I made cost sheets and calculated margins. It wasn't bitter, it was practical. Romance was a privilege. And I had learned early that practical women didn't wait to be chosen. They learned to choose for themselves. At family events, the contrast between me and my cousins was never subtle. Their parents, my aunts and uncles, talked about college admissions, debutante balls, cotillions, country club memberships. My mother smiled politely and refilled the deviled egg platter. She was always welcome, always helpful, but never quite seen. And neither was I. They called me sweet, thoughtful, quiet. They said I had a kind face. All the words people use when they don't know what else to say about a girl who doesn't shine loud enough to blind them. I remember sitting at the kids' table at Victoria's birthday party. She was turning 16 and had just been gifted a Mercedes. I was 14 and wearing a blouse I'd embroidered myself, the thread tight where I'd misjudged the tension. One of her friends asked if it was from a vintage store. I said yes. It felt easier than explaining that my mother and I had stayed up late trying to get it finished in time. That moment stuck with me, not because I felt embarrassed, but because I realized something. People see what they expect to see. They expected discount, so that's what they assumed. I never corrected them. Not once. It wasn't that I was ashamed. I loved what my mother did. I respected it. She worked harder than anyone I knew, and she made brides feel beautiful without ever stepping into the spotlight herself. But I also knew how people looked at her, and by extension, me. Like we were on the other side of the glass, useful but never central, vital but never valued. School didn't help. I was good at math, great with logistics, and terrible at pretending to care about things like designer labels or the latest trip someone's family took to Bali. I kept to myself, took every elective I could find in business and design. I watched the rich kids plan prom proposals like movie trailers, while I quietly organized events for the school fundraiser that actually turned a profit. I didn't go to prom. I went to the fabric district with my mom that weekend and helped her close a huge last-minute rush job for a panicked bride who'd spilled red wine on her dress 3 days before her ceremony. We stayed up till 4 a.m. fixing it. That was my version of a corsage. When I got into college on scholarships, work study, and sheer persistence, no one in my family made a big deal. I didn't expect them to. Victoria was already at Yale. Madeline was interning at a fashion house in New York thanks to her father's connections. Elise was planning a year abroad, paid in full by her family. I took the bus across the state, moved into a tiny dorm room, and started working the front desk at a wedding boutique 3 blocks from campus. It felt familiar, safe, like coming home. But it also opened my eyes. The women who came into that boutique had money. Yes, but they also had fear. Fear of looking cheap. Fear of judgment. Fear that one bad chair sash would become a family scandal. I watched them obsess over napkin folds and centerpiece symmetry, and I thought, so this is what they mean by taste. It wasn't elegance. It was anxiety, dressed up in white chiffon. I became the best associate they had within a year. I knew silhouettes better than the senior stylists, could read a bride's body language faster than she could verbalize her insecurity. I understood what weddings really were: performances, rituals, theater, and I knew how to produce them. I learned how to calculate upcharges, how to negotiate vendor discounts, how to translate someone's vague Pinterest dream into an invoice. Eventually, I wasn't just selling dresses. I was selling moments, versions of identity, and people paid a lot for those. Every summer I went back home, and every time it was the same. My cousins would gather with their bright teeth and passive insults. They'd ask how the shop was, never quite remembering what I actually did. They'd talk about brands I knew intimately from wholesale catalogs, from the back-end spreadsheets of the boutiques they trusted. I never corrected them. Not when they said I was still figuring things out. Not when they asked if I wanted to be a stylist forever. Let them talk. Let them laugh. I was watching. I was building. I wasn't the hand-me-down girl anymore. I was a blueprint in progress. And they hadn't even looked up from their champagne long enough to notice. Elise's wedding was the first one that truly shook me. She was the youngest of the 3 cousins, the one who had always coasted through life with a combination of charm and disinterest, as if luxury were something she had inherited by divine right. Her wedding was held at a vineyard in Napa during peak season. I remember the invitation thick ivory cardstock with gold foil edges sealed in a blush velvet envelope. My name was embossed like I belonged there, but the moment I arrived, I knew I didn't. The ceremony overlooked acres of vines. Guests were ushered to their seats by men in white gloves. There were signature cocktails with monogrammed stir sticks. At dinner, every course came with its own wine pairing, and the menus were printed on handmade paper flown in from Italy. The bride wore Vera Wang couture. Her shoes had their own stylist. The wedding planner looked vaguely familiar, and it took me hours to realize I'd read about her in a trade journal the month before. Everything was calculated, coordinated, and obscenely expensive. I sat at a table near the back, between a dermatologist from Los Angeles and a tech executive who couldn't stop talking about his second home in Jackson Hole. No one asked what I did. I wasn't wearing the kind of dress that sparked curiosity. I kept my smile warm and my posture perfect, and I watched. I watched Elise float through the crowd, glowing, adored, photographed from every angle like royalty. I watched my aunt tear up during the speeches and my uncle beam with pride as he announced how much they'd spent not directly, but through veiled comments about custom imported florals and 7 months of vendor coordination. I saw the wedding not as a ceremony but as a broadcast, an assertion of status, a declaration of worth, and something inside me crystallized. The thing no one talks about is how loud weddings can be, not just in volume, but in performance. They hum with expectation, tension, the weight of being seen. But there's another layer, one you only notice if you're standing just outside the glow. It's the quiet, the places between the spotlights. That's where I stood always. That's where I took notes. Madeline's wedding came next, 2 years later. Winter, Manhattan. A rooftop venue with heated glass ceilings and snowfall engineered for the photos. Guests were given cashmere wraps to brave the walk from the elevator to the main hall, though most never let them touch their shoulders, too afraid of looking bulky in pictures. She'd chosen an all-white palette, linens, flowers, candles, everything, and had dancers perform a contemporary ballet during the reception. I saw the same photographer team I'd once helped coordinate for a client. The planner, one of Aurora and Thorne's elite partners. I stayed in the corner, smiled when spoken to, and absorbed everything. I knew the budget before anyone told me. I could see it in the crystal glassware, in the imported orchids lining the staircase, in the way they printed new place cards halfway through the evening because a name was spelled wrong. I watched my mother make polite conversation with a woman who once turned down her alteration services because her prices were too low to be credible. She never flinched. Neither did I. Victoria's wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a coronation. Her parents booked a coastal estate in Maine, the kind you see in movies but never visit. It was spread across multiple days' welcome brunch, yacht cocktail cruise, rehearsal dinner, the ceremony itself, and then a farewell breakfast with monogrammed croissants. I'm not exaggerating. The flowers alone must have cost more than my entire college education. Fireworks exploded over the water at the end of the night, and Victoria walked through falling petals like she was ascending into a different class of person. Maybe she was. I was 28 by then and already knee-deep in my own business. I had bought out a struggling event firm with the money I'd saved and a micro-loan from a women's entrepreneur fund. The paperwork had been a nightmare. The transition took months. The staff was wary of me young, quiet, wearing second-hand blazers and arriving early to sweep the floor. But I knew what I was doing. I had seen behind the curtain of weddings like Victoria's, and I knew how to replicate the fantasy without the waste. By the time I sat at Victoria's reception, dressed in a rented gown and heels I'd padded with inserts to survive the evening, I already had 3 teams running under me. I'd negotiated contracts with florists who also worked those grand events, offering them less visibility but more predictable pay. I'd studied client psychology, pricing psychology, and operational efficiency. I could quote a vendor clause from memory. I understood how much markup was built into every exclusive package. I was quiet, but I was building something loud. No one at the wedding knew. When Madeline complimented the way I'd done my hair, "It's so sweet how you don't fuss over these things," I smiled and thanked her. When Elise asked if I was still helping out at that shop, I nodded and said I liked the flexibility. I never corrected them. I didn't need to. They lived in the glitter. I lived in the quiet. And one day I knew they'd hear me. But not yet. Not while they were still taking selfies beside $80 centerpieces I'd ordered wholesale for 1/10 of the cost. Not while they were tagging the same agency whose quarterly reports I had started reading in board meetings. Not while they laughed about their weddings costing a small fortune, because small fortunes were exactly what they'd handed me without realizing it. I stayed silent, and I kept working. Let them sparkle. I was building this chandelier. Most people assumed I worked the counter at a dress shop because it looked like the kind of job someone like me would have: low stakes, pleasant, decorative. And in the beginning, they weren't wrong. After college, I took the first position I could get that kept me close to the wedding industry without demanding capital I didn't yet have. It was a boutique in a trendy part of town, the kind that charged $6,000 for a dress and called it accessible luxury. I greeted brides, poured sparkling water into stemless flutes, fluffed trains, and gently directed emotional mothers back to the seating area. It was easy to play the part. I was naturally soft-spoken, efficient, and observant. No one suspected I was studying every invoice that came through the back office, every supplier contract, every seasonal price fluctuation in lace and silk. After hours, I'd offer to stay late to steam gowns or organize stock. What I was really doing was memorizing inventory patterns, learning which designers moved and which ones sat untouched. I watched what brides gravitated toward versus what they actually purchased. I made note of how consultants used language to manipulate perception, calling something one of a kind, even when we had 4 more in storage, labeling it runway exclusive because it was seen once in a preview photo on Instagram. I tracked how long appointments ran when a bride came in with her mother versus when she brought her friends. I learned that lighting and scent were more powerful than any sales pitch. Within a year, I knew more about that boutique's inner workings than the manager did. She started relying on me without realizing it, asking me to double-check delivery schedules, to just glance over vendor emails, to handle high-strung clients she couldn't calm. I said yes to everything, and I never pushed. I made myself small enough to be indispensable. I stayed later, came in earlier. I did it all with a smile, while in private I was building a blueprint. At night, I would sit in my small apartment with takeout and a legal pad and sketch out what my own business might look like. Not just a boutique, a full-service firm design, planning, sourcing, execution. I knew what was missing from the industry: authenticity. Everyone was chasing grandeur, but few understood intimacy. People wanted to feel seen, not sold to. Brides were exhausted, grooms overwhelmed, parents confused, and the planners with the biggest names often treated their clients like packages on a conveyor belt, slotting them into templated timelines and upselling emotion like it was a line item. I didn't have money, but I had time. And I had clarity. The opportunity came in the form of a failing firm across town. It was one of those second-generation businesses once successful, but now mismanaged by a disinterested heir who wanted out. They still had client files, vendor relationships, and a warehouse lease on a space full of underused props and furniture. The price was low enough to make it feasible, especially with a small grant I'd qualified for through a local women's entrepreneurship initiative. I met with the owner over coffee, listened patiently while he explained how the market's just dried up and how people aren't getting married like they used to. I nodded, knowing he was wrong. People were still getting married, they just weren't trusting people like him anymore. I signed the papers that week. Rebranding was my first act. I dropped the dated name and chose something simple, elegant, and neutral. I redesigned the website myself, learned just enough HTML to get by, took photos of previous events and edited them into sleek case studies, rewrote the messaging in a tone that felt human. My first hires were 2 assistants women like me, sharp and overlooked. We worked from my apartment at first, then from the warehouse when the lease turned over. It smelled like dust and stale roses, but it had bones. Those first few months were brutal. I slept 4 hours a night, toggling between sales calls, client meetings, bookkeeping, and manual labor. I drove my own sedan across the city with folding chairs jammed in the back seat. I stood on ladders stringing lights. I cleaned up confetti with my bare hands. But every month, our bookings grew. Word of mouth started to spread. We weren't flashy, but we delivered. And we listened. We treated clients like people, not projects. Then came Aurora and Thorne. I'd known about them for years. They were the crown jewel of wedding firms' luxury without apology. They operated like a fashion house with regional franchises across the country and strict standards for branding and client experience. Most planners in my position would have seen them as competition. I saw them as infrastructure. They had everything I didn't name: recognition, supplier leverage, a built-in clientele willing to pay triple for the same services I already offered, but they lacked something too: humanity, warmth. Their franchisees, while polished, often felt distant, impersonal, scripted. That gap was my window. I started by studying their playbook literally. I ordered a copy of their training manual from a third-party resale site and dissected it like scripture. I learned their language, their hierarchy, their expansion model. They had openings in second-tier markets, places with emerging client bases but fewer elite planners. I reached out under a corporate alias, pitched a proposal, and got a meeting. By then, I had numbers to back me up. 5 full weddings per month, a 93% client retention rate, and margins that showed consistency even during off-seasons. They were impressed, but cautious. So was I. The licensing agreement was strict. I couldn't use my own name. I had to adhere to their visual standards, but the back end was mine to run. And I knew that once inside, I could shape the experience quietly, without fanfare. I signed the deal and began operating under their brand. Clients saw the logo and relaxed. They trusted the name. But what they really loved, what they talked about in their glowing reviews, was the way our team made them feel. We took their stress and turned it into clarity. We gave them more than aesthetics. We gave them peace. In less than a year, we became one of Aurora and Thorne's most profitable regions. And still, no one knew, especially not my family. They thought I was still working weddings. They'd make comments at reunions about how fun it must be to play with flowers and ribbons all day. Once, Victoria asked if I ever considered becoming a real event manager, like for corporate stuff. I nodded and changed the subject. Elise once asked if I could get her a discount on a dress she liked. I said I'd look into it. Madeline sent me a link to a blog post about side hustles for creative women. I forwarded it to my assistant and laughed. They never asked about my actual work. They didn't see the office space I leased in the center of town. They didn't see the growing team, the press mentions, the spreadsheets with 6-digit totals. They didn't see my name in internal memos from the corporate office. They didn't know I was invited to the annual Aurora and Thorne conference as one of the keynote contributors. They didn't know that their own weddings, the ones they posted with hashtags and filters and effusive praise, had paid part of my down payment on a 2-bedroom loft I'd bought in cash. And they didn't ask, which suited me fine. I never needed them to notice. I needed room to build. Let them think I was a clerk. Let them believe I steamed dresses and tied bows. Let them say, "Good for you," with thin smiles and half-heard interest. Because the day was coming. The day I would walk past their whispers and into the spotlight they thought was theirs alone. And I would do it quietly, as always. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It walks in already holding the contract. The proposal wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen on a mountaintop or in a candlelit restaurant. There was no hidden photographer or champagne on standby. It happened in our kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning while I was barefoot and halfway through a bagel. Noah simply looked up from the crossword and said, "I've been thinking. Should we just do it?" I blinked. Crumbs stuck to my lip. Do what? Get married. There was no fanfare, no ring in sight, just a softness in his voice that made everything around us feel still. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like breathing. "Yeah," I said. "Let's." That was it. No diamond, no down-on-one-knee performance. Just two people in sync, deciding together. It was perfect, and completely wrong by my family's standards. When word got out, the responses were predictably lukewarm. My mother, ever cautious, simply asked, "Are you sure you don't want to wait until he can get you a proper ring?" I told her I already had everything I needed. My Aunt Catherine texted a polite congratulations with a smiley face and a photo of Victoria's engagement ring as a comparison. I didn't reply. Elise called to say how brave it was that we were planning something so chill. Madeline sent a Pinterest board titled "Cute Backyard Ideas Low Budget." Every gesture felt condescending, wrapped in the thin veneer of faux support. I didn't blame them. Not really. They were trained to equate love with spectacle. For them, intimacy only counted if it was publicly affirmed, preferably in high resolution with professional lighting. The thought of a wedding without custom calligraphy or imported linens was sacrilege. But Noah and I weren't interested in performance. We wanted presence. We chose to get married in my Aunt George's backyard. She was the only one in the family who had never made me feel like I had to apologize for existing. Her garden was wild and unpolished, the kind of space where sunflowers grew taller than fences and herbs spilled over onto the walkways. When I asked her if we could use it, she cried. "I'd be honored," she said. "Just don't invite that florist who charged me $300 for a handful of daisies last year." I promised I wouldn't. We set the date for early June, peak bloom. I designed the invitations myself, simple, hand-cut cards with a pressed lavender sprig attached by twine. Noah and I wrote them together, laughing at the wording, "Bring love, leave judgment. Wear shoes you can dance in. We'll provide the lemonade, you bring the joy." We knew it wasn't traditional, but it was ours. The dress took the longest. I didn't want to wear anything off a rack, not because I couldn't afford it, but because none of it felt right. So I went into the back room of our warehouse, found a roll of ivory silk from a discontinued collection, and started sketching. It took me 3 months to sew. I worked on it at night, alone, with soft music playing and a cup of tea beside me. Every stitch was a choice. Every seam was deliberate. I didn't want extravagance, I wanted meaning. The hem was hand-finished with a thread my mother had given me years ago. The lining held an embroidered message in French, something my grandmother used to say, "Que la simplicité soit ton luxe." Let simplicity be your luxury. When the invitations went out, the reactions trickled in like cold rain. Elise called first. "Backyard? That's cute. Like rustic chic?" Madeline commented on the RSVP site. "Can't wait to see the vibe, bet it'll be very you." Victoria didn't respond at all for 3 weeks, then finally RSVP'd with a +1 and a single line. "Let me know if you need help with decor. I still have crates from my wedding you can borrow." I politely declined. The jokes began to circulate in the group chat they forgot to exclude me from. "BYO chair? Hope the bugs RSVP'd too. Camille going full Pinterest board on us." I stayed quiet. I read every message, then archived the thread. I didn't have the energy to defend a joy they couldn't comprehend. Noah saw the messages, of course. He was sitting beside me when they popped up. He didn't say anything at first. Just reached over, squeezed my hand, and said, "They have no idea who they're laughing at." I smiled, not because it made me feel better, but because he was right. My team offered to step in, but I declined. I didn't want this to be a company production. I wanted it to be mine. That said, I didn't hesitate to lean on the vendors I'd built relationships with over the years. The flowers came from a local grower I'd supported during the pandemic. The food was cooked by a friend of Noah's who ran a vegan pop-up on weekends. The photographer owed me a favor from a last-minute save 2 years ago. Everything was bartered, traded, or gifted with intention. We built the ceremony space ourselves, repainted old benches, strung lights between trees, wove garlands from wild ivy. My mother and I spent one entire weekend making paper flowers from old books and faded sheet music. She didn't say much while we worked, but when we finished the last one, she looked at me and said, "This is beautiful, Camille. Just like you." It was the first time in years she'd looked at me without comparison in her eyes. That alone made the work worth it. Noah's suit came from a thrift store. He looked dashing, even with the sleeves slightly too short. I told him it added charm. He told me I was blinding in my beauty. I believed him. 2 weeks before the wedding, Victoria asked me out of the blue if I had a backup plan in case it rained. "I'm sure you do," she added, "since, you plan weddings and all." I could tell it was meant to sound supportive, but her voice was lined with skepticism. I told her we had tents. She nodded like she'd just confirmed a theory. The closer we got to the day, the louder the silence from my cousins became. It was the same pattern they'd always followed: mock first, ignore second, then show up looking surprised when everything turned out better than expected. I didn't care anymore. I had long since stopped waiting for their approval. But still, there was a part of me, quiet and small, that wondered what they'd say when they saw it all. Not because I wanted their praise, but because I wanted them to see how wrong they'd been. Every detail of our wedding was layered in meaning. The cupcakes were baked by my neighbor's daughter, who'd just started a small business. The music came from a band Noah and I had seen on our first road trip, now booked through a handwritten note and a PayPal deposit. The chairs were borrowed from a community center. The aisle runner was stitched from fabric swatches collected over the past decade of my work. Even the table numbers were handwritten by a former client who'd insisted on contributing when she found out I was getting married. It was messy, imperfect, glorious, and it was almost time. Our time. My turn not to impress them, not to compete, but to stand fully in the life I had built for myself, quietly and with care, and to show them what love looked like when you stripped away the price tag. It didn't need a chandelier. It needed sky, soil, sun, and someone worth standing beside. That I already had. I spent the nights before the wedding sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of our apartment, surrounded by scraps of paper, hot glue threads, and half-finished bouquets. The paper flowers took longer than expected, much longer. Each one had to be cut, curled, glued, shaped over and over, hundreds of times. My hands ached from holding scissors. My back throbbed from hunching forward, but there was something steadying about it, something meditative. In a world where beauty was so often bought, there was defiance in making it with my own hands. I didn't tell many people how much I was doing myself. Not because I was ashamed, far from it, but because I knew how it would be perceived. My cousins, who hired planners to hire their planners, would twist it into something pitiful. "Oh, how quaint," they'd say. She's doing her own flowers. And they'd laugh about it later in group chats full of emojis and quiet superiority. I could already hear the phrases DY Queen, Pinterest Bride, Budget Fantasy. I'd heard them used before, usually whispered at weddings that didn't hit the acceptable threshold of extravagance. The bar kept moving. No one ever said it directly to the bride's face, but I had always been good at reading subtext. The flowers weren't even the half of it. I designed the place cards myself, slicing each one from recycled craft paper and hand-lettering them with a dip pen that had belonged to my grandfather. The table runners were sewn from linen remnants I'd bargained for in a warehouse sale months earlier. I hand-stitched the hem of each napkin. I dipped taper candles in batches in our kitchen, dyeing them one shade of blush at a time until the color matched the ribbon I'd saved from an old shoot. Everything was curated, considered. Not expensive, but intentional. And still, I knew what they would see. They would see lack, the absence of luxury, the absence of brand names, the absence of proof. Because that's what they measured worth by, proof of spending. When Elise posted a story of her pre-wedding dress fitting last year, it had tagged 6 different designers. When Madeline's florist flew in peonies from Holland in the off-season, she made sure the floral invoice made it onto her blog post. Victoria once bragged that her champagne was the same label Beyoncé had served at her vow renewal. I remembered smiling politely as she said it, pretending to be impressed, even though I'd used that exact label 2 years prior at a nonprofit gala for half the price. It wasn't about the actual wedding, it was about the signal, and I was about to send a very different one. As the day approached, I could feel the attention begin to swirl. At first, it came in small, sugary bites. Elise texted me a photo of a chandelier she hadn't ended up using. "Let me know if you want it. I feel like it would elevate the garden vibe." I thanked her and declined. Madeline called to ask if I'd hired a coordinator. "I mean, you must have someone, even day of?" I told her Noah and I were managing the logistics ourselves. "Wow," she said, a pause heavy with judgment. "That's brave." Victoria didn't reach out directly, but I heard through my mother that she'd offered to sponsor. A few upgrades if we were falling short. Falling short. As if love could be measured in imported silverware. As if intimacy needed uplighting. I didn't argue. I never did. I just kept working. Every morning before heading to the warehouse, I carved out 2 hours to finalize another detail. I wrapped each votive candle with a band of pressed botanical paper I had found in a clearance bin. I printed the ceremony programs using the studio printer after hours, cutting and tying each with waxed twine. I made a guest book from a vintage photo album I'd found at an estate sale, layering in empty Polaroid sleeves for people to fill. I even rewired some old garden lights with Noah, testing each string in the dark to make sure no bulbs were out. He teased me for being a perfectionist. I didn't deny it. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about control, dignity, creating something so rooted in intention that no amount of ridicule could touch it. But of course, the ridicule came anyway. 3 days before the wedding, Elise posted a sneak peek of her outfit, a dusty rose silk dress, designer heels, a clutch that cost more than our entire catering budget. The caption read, "Off to celebrate love, in a garden, apparently." Madeline followed up with a photo of a sun hat and sandals, writing, "Preparing for bugs, wine in solo cups, and Camille's lemonade stand dreams." Victoria simply posted an image of a champagne tower from her own wedding and captioned it, "When you know the standard." It was passive, petty, predictable. I saw all of it. I screenshotted each one, not out of hurt, but for the record. So that one day, I could look back and remember how confidently they mocked what they could never create. Even my mother, who had stayed largely silent throughout, started to get nervous. "You don't think it'll look too homemade, do you?" she asked one night as we arranged the seating chart together. "Not everyone understands the whole aesthetic thing." I smiled, gently repositioning a card she'd accidentally skewed. "It'll look exactly the way it's meant to look," I said. She nodded, but I could tell she was worried. They had her convinced too. And maybe that's what stung more than anything, that even the woman who raised me was afraid I'd be judged and found lacking, not because of anything real, but because of the noise, the weight of their sneering expectations. I wanted to tell her everything, about the logo stitched into the hem of my dress, about the team who'd helped me behind the scenes, about the fact that the champagne I'd ordered was from the exact same vineyard Victoria had used, just bottled under a different label. I wanted to scream that they were dancing inside a brand I owned, that every detail they mocked was crafted with more skill than any of them had ever shown in their entire curated lives. But I didn't, because that wasn't the plan, because I didn't need their respect in advance. I needed it in silence, on the day itself, when the flowers bloomed, when the vows echoed across the garden, when the light hit the gold thread just right. So I stayed quiet, and I kept folding paper flowers, building centerpieces out of poetry and resilience, wiring garlands with a surgeon's precision and a poet's patience. My body was tired, my hands calloused, but I had never felt more sure of myself. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. Let them post their smug little captions. Because I wasn't just making wedding decor, I was building armor. And beneath the flowers, my spine was steel. The morning of the wedding dawned quiet and warm, with that kind of soft golden light that feels like a promise. The garden was still, dew clinging to the tips of the grass and petals gently waking to the sun. I stood barefoot on the back porch of my aunt's house, holding a cup of tea and listening to the hush before movement. It was the final breath before everything began, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe it would be okay, that maybe, just maybe, it could unfold without cruelty. But I knew better. The first car pulled in just after 10. Elise arrived in a white SUV that looked like it had never seen a speed bump. She stepped out in towering heels and a blush-colored dress that hugged her like a billboard. Her hair was perfect, of course, sleek and curled at the ends, a style that screamed money and time. She barely looked around before pulling out her phone and snapping a photo of the garden gate. I could already see the caption in my head. Something about fairy tales. Something mocking. She didn't see me watching from behind the curtain, but I saw her reaction as her eyes swept the yard, curious, amused, and already calculating. Madeline came next. She wore a linen jumpsuit that probably cost more than our entire lighting setup. She hugged Elise, then immediately took out her phone as well. I recognized the slight tilt of her wrist, the way her thumb moved. She was posting something. Then came the whisper. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. They leaned in together, smiling with that tight-lipped expression of people enjoying a private joke. And I knew. It had begun. They didn't wait. Not even until the ceremony. Their laughter started soft and spread in ripples. It wasn't loud or overt, it was worse. It was practiced, polished, designed to avoid confrontation but ensure that I noticed. Side glances, eyebrow lifts, suppressed giggles behind manicured hands. A shared look as someone opened a mason jar of lemonade. A muffled chuckle as they passed the homemade cupcakes. A glance toward the folding chairs, as if they might collapse under the weight of their judgment. I didn't respond. I moved through the garden like a ghost, adjusting last-minute details. I straightened the aisle runner. I fluffed the petals that had shifted in the breeze. I fixed the misaligned frame on the welcome sign. My body was in motion, but my ears heard everything. "It's giving summer camp," someone whispered. "My cousin did something like this in college," another said, but hers was more polished. I caught a reference to a picnic. Someone muttered something about ants. Another asked if the cupcakes were gluten-free and then laughed as if the question itself was absurd. I wanted to disappear, not because I was ashamed, because I was furious, because I had worked for months to make this day meaningful, because I had put pieces of myself into every ribbon, every menu card, every candle flickering in the summer breeze. And here they were, reducing it all to a meme in their private circle. Victoria arrived last. She wore black. It was sleek and modern, probably designer, but it looked funereal in the midday sun. She didn't smile as she walked in. Her eyes scanned the scene like a critic entering a gallery. She paused in front of the guest book, frowned slightly, then moved on. When she hugged Elise and Madeline, her lips barely moved, but I saw the subtle shake of her head. A silent judgment. A queen disappointed by the village fate. They were careful not to be cruel directly. They never said anything to my face. They smiled when I walked past, complimented the flowers with a hint of surprise in their tone, remarked on the charm of the setting like it was an Airbnb they hadn't expected much from. It was the same tone they'd used for years, fake kindness wrapped in velvet condescension. They didn't notice the way Noah looked at me as I walked toward him with the last piece of twine for the ceremony arch. They didn't see the tears in my aunt's eyes as she stood on her porch, watching the transformation of her garden into something sacred. They didn't hear the way my mother whispered, "I'm proud of you," as she brushed an invisible wrinkle from my sleeve. All they saw was a lack of marble, of champagne towers, of cold imported elegance. They had no idea they were standing inside something they couldn't understand. After guests began arriving, I stepped inside to dress. My gown hung in the sunlit bedroom, soft and fluid, its hem barely brushing the hardwood floor. I dressed slowly, deliberately, savoring each motion. As I pulled the fabric over my shoulders and fastened the hidden buttons, I could feel my breath deepen. This wasn't the dress they expected. No designer tag, no dramatic train, just silk, structure, and soul. And stitched inside the hem, where no one but me could see, was the gold thread. The logo, Aurora and Thorn. It wasn't meant to be public. It wasn't there to prove anything. It was a quiet reminder. A symbol of the empire they had no idea I ran. The business they bragged about hiring. The brand they built their weddings on. They didn't know they were standing inside the ecosystem I'd created. That the chairs they mocked were sourced from one of my suppliers. That the flowers they found unexpected were arranged by someone on my payroll. That the lighting was installed by the same crew who had strung chandeliers for Elise's rehearsal dinner 2 years ago. Their laughter was echoing inside my work, and they didn't even know it. When I stepped outside again, the murmurs shifted. For a moment, silence settled. Heads turned. I caught Victoria's eye. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened on her clutch. Madeline's mouth parted slightly. Elise blinked twice. Their eyes dropped to the hem of my dress, and I could almost hear their thoughts. It wasn't what they expected. It was too clean, too tailored, too elegant to dismiss. Still, they said nothing. But the whispers stopped. For the first time, I walked past them and didn't feel small. I felt composed. Complete. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them record it, share it, spin it into one more story where I was the punchline. Because this time, I wasn't the girl folding chairs. I was the architect of the room. And before the day was over, they'd feel it. Not in words, not in confrontation, but in the shift of their silence, in the way the laughter died before the ceremony began, and in the way they would leave wondering how I'd done it, how it had all looked so effortless, so beautiful, so far beyond their mockery. It was the beginning of their reckoning, and I didn't have to say a word. The dress was always the quiet center of the plan. Not the flowers, not the food, not even the venue. Just the dress. I had known from the moment we decided on the backyard wedding that it would have to be different. Not louder, not flashier, just true. Honest. A reflection of the woman I had become and the world I had built without applause. I didn't want drama. I didn't want a train that required 6 people to manage, or a corset so tight I'd faint halfway through my vows. I wanted elegance that whispered instead of screamed, power that stood still. I started with a roll of silk I had kept for years, tucked in the corner of our warehouse beneath bolts of fabric no one wanted. It was a pale ivory with a subtle sheen, not quite matte, not quite gloss. The kind of fabric that moved like water and caught the light in quiet ways. It had been part of a discontinued collection from a Paris supplier, and I had rescued it from a clearance bin during a sourcing trip. At the time, I hadn't known why I needed it. I just did. When I brought it home, I ran my hands over it again and again, feeling the weight, the texture, the possibility. I sketched for hours silhouettes, seams, necklines, backs. At night, I pinned muslin mock-ups to my dress form and stepped back, analyzing every curve and line, adjusting for balance and grace. The final design was simple. Cap sleeves, a soft V at the neckline, a slightly flared skirt with movement but no drama. Clean lines, tailored to my body like a secret. But the real detail was invisible. Inside the lining, just above the hem, I hand-stitched something only I would see. A golden embroidery, small, deliberate, precise. A&T, the monogram of Aurora and Thorn. It wasn't a flex. It wasn't meant to provoke. It was a signature, a quiet truth sewn into the garment like a vow to myself. This dress wasn't from their catalog. It wasn't from any boutique. It wasn't gifted or borrowed or altered. It was mine. Designed, cut, sewn, and finished by my hands, and stitched with the logo of the very empire they thought belonged to someone else. The irony made me smile every time I touched it. As the day of the wedding approached, the dress became more than fabric. It was a meditation. Every hour I spent shaping it was an hour spent processing every comment I'd ever swallowed, every glance I'd ever dodged, every "you tried" that was meant to sound like support. When I pressed the seams, I thought about the way Elise once told me she could never wear something handmade because she needed structure. When I hand-finished the neckline, I remembered how Madeline once said I had a sweet face, but not bridal energy. When I adjusted the waist darts, I recalled Victoria's comment at her own bridal shower how weddings were a woman's real debut and how not everyone is meant to headline. Each stitch answered them. I didn't need their stage. I had built my own. On the morning of the wedding, I put the dress on in silence. No stylists, no champagne. Just my mother in the room, holding back tears as she watched me zip it up. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She knew what it meant. For years, she had watched me fit other people's dreams. Now, I was wearing my own. The fabric clung in the right places, moved with my body like it had been born there. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't stiff. It breathed. I wore flat shoes underneath, wrapped in satin to match the hem. No veil. Just a comb in my hair made from bits of wire and pressed petals, something I had assembled in a moment of inspiration after midnight the week before. When I stepped out into the garden, there was a pause. It wasn't audible, but I felt it. A shift in air. A stillness. Heads turned. Conversations softened. My cousins looked up from their drinks, eyes narrowing first in confusion, then in realization. I knew exactly what they were thinking. She looks good. She looks expensive. She looks real. Their brains scrambled to make sense of it. No designer tag. No public fittings. No sponsored posts. And yet the dress looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. It didn't fit into their narrative. They were waiting for a punchline, and I had given them poetry. Victoria was the first to break the silence. Her gaze dropped just for a second to the hem of my dress. Her brow furrowed. Her eyes scanned the seam. She leaned slightly to the side, as if trying to get a better angle. I knew the moment it clicked. The logo wasn't large, but it was distinct. Her pupils tightened. Her lips parted slightly. Then she turned to Elise and said something under her breath. Elise looked, then froze. Madeline leaned forward, her posture shifting from boredom to alert. They recognized it. They saw the signature, the same one sewn into their own gowns. But they didn't understand. Not yet. I walked past them with my head high, letting the silk trail softly over the stone path. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The confusion behind me was palpable, the disbelief, the dawning discomfort. It wrapped around their perfect posture like fog, cold and creeping. This was not the narrative they had rehearsed. They expected humble. They got sovereign. They expected apology. They got authorship. That dress my dress was the quiet knife that cut through the years of condescension. It didn't shout. It didn't sparkle. It didn't announce. It just existed, flawless and unbothered, right in front of them, like a truth they couldn't unsee. And I wore it not for them, not even for Noah. I wore it for the girl who used to pin hems in the back room and wonder what it would feel like to be the one walking down the aisle. I wore it for every moment I swallowed someone else's opinion and kept working anyway. I wore it because I could, because I had earned it, because it was mine. And stitched into the hem, small, golden, and eternal, was the reminder they never saw coming. I didn't rent the dress. I owned the brand. It happened during dinner. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting a golden haze over the garden. Strings of soft lights had begun to glow above the tables, and the scent of roasted vegetables and rosemary hung in the air like perfume. People were laughing, clinking glasses, leaning in close to tell stories as candles flickered between them. It was everything I had wanted: warmth without pretense, beauty without spectacle. I moved between tables, thanking guests for coming, checking in on food and comfort, adjusting the smallest of details without anyone noticing. Years of working weddings had trained me to see everything: the empty glass, the crooked frame, the guest lingering too long alone. But this time, I wasn't the planner. I was the bride. And still, I couldn't stop. Not because I didn't trust my team, but because this was mine, my creation, my day. I wanted to feel every moment of it under my fingertips. My cousins sat together, of course. Elise, Madeline, and Victoria had claimed a table near the front, close enough to be seen, far enough to remain aloof. They had settled into their roles effortlessly, casual observers with calculated expressions, sipping wine and exchanging glances as if still trying to decide whether this was a wedding or an elaborate DIY picnic. I could feel their eyes on me every time I passed by. Not curious, critical. Measuring. They hadn't spoken to me directly since the ceremony. No compliments on the vows, no questions about the setup. Just a few vague smiles and a nod from Madeline when I greeted her earlier. I didn't mind. Their silence gave me space to breathe. But I knew it wouldn't last. The reveal wasn't planned. Not exactly. I had considered a dozen scenarios in which it might happen: accidental glimpses, overheard conversations, maybe a moment during a toast. But in the end, it was perfectly unremarkable. A guest asked about the table runners. "They're lovely," she said, her fingers brushing the soft linen. "Are they from your planner?" I smiled. "Not exactly," I replied. "They're from my team." Victoria overheard. She turned slightly in her chair. "Your team?" I nodded, calm and deliberate. "Yes. I run a wedding design company. We handled most of the elements here." Madeline tilted her head. "Wait, you planned your own wedding?" Elise laughed, a brittle sound. "Of course she did. Camille's always been crafty." I let the comment hang there for a second. Then I said it. "Actually, it's a bit more than that. I run a regional franchise for Aurora and Thorn." The words landed like soft thunder. There was no gasp, no dropped glass, just the slight widening of eyes, the flicker of recalibration, the quiet disbelief folding itself into their posture. Victoria blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" I looked at her, steady. "I've been running one of their most profitable divisions for over 3 years now. Most of the vendors here are part of my network, including your florist, Madeline, and your lighting team, Elise. And yes, your dresses were from my stock." They stared at me like they had never seen me before, like I'd slipped out of my skin and into someone else's. I could see the pieces rearranging in their minds, the logo, the dress, the quality, the way everything had looked so right. "You're joking," Madeline said, but there was no laughter behind it. "No," I replied. "This entire wedding, what you've been side-eyeing and whispering about all day, was orchestrated by the same brand you've each bragged about using. Only this time, we didn't charge a premium. We didn't pad the invoice. We didn't need to." Elise leaned forward, her voice a touch too sharp. "So what? This was some kind of statement?" I tilted my head. "No, this was a wedding. My wedding. But if it felt like a statement to you, maybe ask yourself why." They went quiet again, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but thick with realization. I left them there, sitting in their silence, and walked away. Not triumphantly, not smugly, just peacefully. I hadn't planned to tell them. I'd thought I'd let them find out months later through whispers or LinkedIn or some offhand comment at a party. But when the moment came, it unfolded like breath. Effortless. Honest. I didn't need to prove anything. I just told the truth. The next hour passed in a blur. Conversations resumed. The music picked up. People danced on the grass, shoes abandoned near the steps, laughter spilling like wine. But the cousins remained changed. They stayed at their table longer than expected. Their smiles were tighter now, their laughter forced. I caught them glancing at the details they had once mocked: the string lights, the handwritten menus, the cupcakes, as if seeing them for the first time, as if trying to understand how something so simple had made them feel so small. It wasn't about the decor. It was about the hierarchy they'd believed in for so long, and how quietly I had rewritten it. They weren't at the top. Not anymore. And I hadn't needed a mic or a toast or a confrontation. Just a dress, a name, a gentle correction in the golden light, and the truth that sometimes the person you dismiss is the one signing your vendor checks. That sometimes the wedding you mock is the blueprint for your own, and that sometimes the girl you called small is already running the room. ChatGPT skazal, the cake was never supposed to be the centerpiece. We hadn't even planned to have one, not in the traditional sense. Noah and I had agreed early on no towering fondant sculptures, no monogram tears, no sugar flowers that looked like porcelain. We wanted something simple, familiar, joyful. So we ordered a stack of small cakes from a local baker we both loved. They were imperfect and soft-edged, covered in whipped cream and layered with seasonal fruit. Strawberry and lemon, vanilla bean with fig. Nothing grand, nothing showy, just sweetness made by hand. The cake sat on a repurposed vintage sideboard I'd found at a garage sale and restored myself. I'd painted it a soft dove gray, lined the drawers with fresh linen, and set it beneath an old oak tree where sunlight filtered down like glitter. Around the cakes, I placed scattered blooms and trays of berries, each labeled in my own handwriting. It looked like something out of a storybook. Modest, inviting, quietly magical. I didn't realize how symbolic that table would become until I saw Elise standing in front of it, her plate untouched, fork frozen midair. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes were scanning the cakes like she was trying to solve a riddle. Madeline was beside her, holding her phone slightly angled, probably about to take a picture. But she hesitated. I approached slowly, a folded napkin in my hand, not planning to stop just to check on things. I could feel the tension shift the second I entered their radius. Elise looked up and dropped her gaze just as quickly. Madeline gave me a smile, too tight, too forced. The kind that stretched skin but didn't reach the eyes. "This is different," Elise said finally, gesturing toward the cakes. I tilted my head, matching her tone. "Yes, it's ours." Victoria walked up behind them, holding a glass of champagne. She didn't speak at first. She just stared at the table, her face unreadable. Then, casually, almost offhandedly, she said, "You really leaned into the whole humble thing." The words weren't sharp. That was never Victoria's style. But they cut all the same. I felt them slide under my ribs like a cold breath. "I leaned into what felt true," I said simply. "Not everything needs a sugar sculpture." Madeline finally took her photo but didn't post it. I watched her thumb hover over the screen, then move to delete instead. That told me more than any compliment ever could. They moved away after that, slowly, as if pulled by some invisible thread, leaving me alone with the cakes and a growing sense of heat behind my sternum. Not anger, no, I was long past that, but something older, something harder to swallow. Not shame, not quite, but close. The memory of shame, maybe. Muscle memory from a time when I would have let that comment unravel me from the inside out. But not now. Not this version of me. I stood there, watching guests line up with small plates, smiling as they chose slices with smudged icing and oozing fruit. I heard them laugh, heard them say things like, "God, this is so good," and "This reminds me of my grandma's kitchen." I watched a little girl reach up on tiptoe for a piece nearly as big as her face and saw her mother crouch to help. I watched Noah, in his sleeves rolled up glory, feed a bite of lemon cake to our friend Owen while they both pretended not to tear up. And then I saw Victoria watching all of it. She stood near the back, her glass still full, untouched. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes were fixed on the scene like it was an exhibit she couldn't make sense of. The joy confused her. The intimacy unsettled her. This wasn't the kind of wedding that had press-worthy lighting or luxury rentals. It wasn't staged or filtered or frozen into posed perfection. It was breathing. And it left her out. I moved toward the edge of the garden, needing air. The sun was setting now, casting everything in gold and fire. I felt the weight of the day pressing into my spine, into the soles of my feet, into the seams of my dress, but it wasn't heavy. It was earned. Then I heard it. A single sentence whispered just behind me. She really thinks this counts. It wasn't meant for me to hear, but I did. I turned. Victoria was speaking to someone I didn't know, another guest, maybe a +1, but her eyes were on me. She didn't flinch. She held my gaze for a beat, then looked away as if the words hadn't mattered. But they had, and not in the way she hoped, because in that moment something in me settled, like a door closing, gently but firmly. That sentence, dismissive, venomous, insecure, told me everything I needed to know. They still didn't get it. They never would. They measured weddings by expense, by performance, by the reaction of strangers. They believed love had to be wrapped in gold to matter. They thought authenticity was just a code word for lack. But the guests who danced barefoot on the lawn didn't need a hashtag to prove they'd had a good time. The couple eating cake with their fingers didn't need a velvet backdrop to make their moment memorable. And I didn't need their approval to validate my joy. They had been looking for something to mock, and instead they found something real, which meant they had nothing to say, not really. Just whispered jabs and cold cake. They were shrinking in a space I had made warm, and in their silence, in their tension, in the way their laughter no longer echoed, I saw the shape of their shame. Hot, uncomfortable, impossible to dress in couture. They were overdressed for a party they no longer understood. And I was home. The cake had started to melt, not in the dramatic way a fondant tower might collapse under a midday sun, but in quiet, almost poetic defiance. The whipped cream began to soften around the edges, the berries glistened just a little more than before, and the lemon curd between the layers sighed into the sponge like it had finally relaxed. It was a warm evening after all. Nothing shocking, nothing tragic. Just a reminder that not everything perfect stays pristine. Sometimes things soften and become more beautiful because of it. I watched from the edge of the garden as guests returned for second helpings, laughing over napkins, licking frosting off their fingers. One of the cakes was already down to its final 2 slices. I could hear someone say, "I don't even like cake, but this is something else." Another voice chimed in, "It tastes like someone actually made it." And they were right. Someone did. Someone who knew exactly how much lemon to add to balance the sweetness. Someone who didn't care about fondant flowers or sugar pearls. It was never about the cake. But in that moment, it became everything. Noah came up beside me, his tie already loosened, his cheeks flushed from dancing. He handed me a glass of champagne and kissed the side of my head. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded. Better than okay. And I was. Even with the heat settling on my skin, even with the scent of flowers and citronella, even with my hair no longer perfectly pinned, I felt rooted, real, present. Every laugh that rippled across the lawn, every candle flickering in its little glass cup, every barefoot guest swaying under the string lights, it all whispered, "You did this." But not everyone was whispering kindness. Behind me, near the cake table, I heard it again. The cold click of a camera phone, a poorly concealed giggle, and then a voice Victoria's. I would have known it anywhere. Cool, level, low enough to feel private, but just audible enough to sting. "I guess this is what happens when you plan your own wedding," she said. "Looks like something from a Pinterest board with too much ambition and not enough budget." The person beside her, a friend, or maybe one of Elise's entourage, laughed. Still, it's cute in a homemade way. Homemade, Victoria repeated, like the word had dirt on it. They didn't see me standing behind the trellis, tucked just out of sight. They didn't see the way my fingers curled around the stem of my glass, or the breath I pulled deep into my lungs to keep my chest from rising too fast. They thought I couldn't hear them. They always had. They thought coldness was safety, that cruelty dressed in elegance was still acceptable if you delivered it with a smile. But I'd learned a different language, one written in careful stitches, in measured details, in the hush of knowing your own worth. I turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked back toward the cake. Victoria saw me first. She straightened, mask sliding into place. "Oh, Camille," she said too brightly. "We were just saying how creative everything is. So charming." I smiled. "Thank you," I said simply. "Everything here was made by hand." I saw it then, the tiny twitch in her jaw, the way her lips almost pressed into a line before she caught herself. Madeline hovered behind her, trying to look occupied with her phone, but not enough to miss the exchange. Elise stood further off, watching the interaction through narrowed eyes, arms folded across her chest. "You know," I added, my voice as even as the table linens I had ironed the night before, "it's funny. The cakes you're mocking were made by the same baker who supplied the dessert bar at Madeline's engagement party. Different price tag, same ingredients." Victoria blinked. "And the flowers?" I said, glancing at the arrangements dotting the tables. "Sourced through the same vendor you used, just not flown in, picked fresh." I let that hang in the air, not bitter, not loud, just factual. A kind of honesty they weren't used to confronting. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It crept in, slowly, replacing the performative smiles with something else, something heavier. Recognition. That's what shame feels like, I realized. Not the heat I used to feel rising in my chest when they dismissed me, not the urge to disappear or prove or please. No shame, real shame, is cold. It stiffens the spine. It silences the room. It replaces certainty with doubt. And I watched it settle across their table like frost. They didn't know what to say. For once, their commentary failed them. There was no clever quip, no backhanded compliment that could smooth it over, because the truth was unavoidable now. They had laughed at something better than they could replicate. They had mocked authenticity while mistaking it for lack. They had misunderstood the difference between excess and excellence. And worst of all, they had underestimated me. I turned away before they could recover. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need an admission. Their stillness was enough. I made my way back to the heart of the celebration, where people danced and spilled drinks and took blurry photos that would live forever in family albums. Someone handed me a plate with a half-melted slice of strawberry cake, and I took it with both hands. It was soft, a little warm from the sun, the edges barely holding their shape. And it was perfect. Later, long after the music faded and the lanterns dimmed, I would remember the look on Victoria's face, not one of cruelty or triumph, but of something far more unsettling. She looked lost, like she had missed something essential, like she had followed all the rules and still ended up outside the warmth of the room. And maybe she had, because while she picked at cold cake and whispered judgment, I had built something she couldn't touch, something rooted, something real, and in that truth, her shame had nowhere to hide. After the last guest left and the final string of lights had been unplugged, I stood barefoot in the middle of the garden and let the silence wrap around me. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels earned. All day I had moved from moment to moment like I was both inside and outside my own body, smiling, talking, hugging, managing the flow with practiced ease. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first hint of night crept across the grass, I was alone with what remained. Crumpled napkins, half-melted candles, a single overturned chair, and the echo of 100 tiny conversations, some kind, some clipped, some filled with envy dressed as politeness. It was over. But something had begun. Noah had gone inside to change. My mother was already washing dishes she hadn't been asked to touch. My aunt sat quietly on the porch, sipping wine from a paper cup, her presence as steady as the oak trees that had shaded us all afternoon. I knew she wouldn't say anything until I was ready. That was her gift. She waited. I moved to the table that had held the cakes now empty except for a few scattered petals and a forgotten fork, and picked up one of the handwritten signs I had made, lemon and fig. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the ink with my thumb. It felt like holding evidence. Not of a party, but of a truth I had finally spoken aloud. That day, I had rewritten everything, not just the expectations for a wedding, not just the narrative they had written for me since childhood. I had rewritten myself, because for years I had played a part. Quiet cousin, dress shop clerk, sweet Camille, the one who helped out, who had good taste, who meant well, but never quite measured up. I had been edited down by their assumptions, cut at the seams by their commentary, pressed into a version of womanhood that fit their comfort but not my truth. But today, I stood in front of all of them wearing the proof. I had shown them the dress. I had spoken the name. I had delivered the reveal not with a shout, but with a stitch. And now they were the ones unsure of their lines. I saw it happen in real time. Elise shrinking behind her sunglasses, Madeline fidgeting with her phone like it could protect her, Victoria searching for a comeback and finding none. Their discomfort wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the way they moved, the way they looked at me like I was someone new, even though I had always been here. They just hadn't seen me. Or maybe they had. And that was the problem. Because the truth was, I didn't become someone else. I just stopped apologizing for who I already was. That's the real rewrite. The one no one talks about. It's not the dramatic transformation, the makeover montage, the overnight success story. It's the slow, deliberate reclaiming of every version of yourself they tried to erase. It's the decision to stop translating your worth into a language they approve of. It's the moment you realize you don't need their headline. You are your own. There had been so many moments over the years when I could have snapped, fought back, thrown their words at them with sharper ones of my own, but I didn't. Not because I was weak, but because I was patient. I was building. And when you're building something real, you don't waste your energy convincing people it matters. You just keep going, brick by brick, until one day they walk inside and realize they're standing in a cathedral they never knew you had the blueprints for. I didn't need to humiliate them. I didn't need revenge. I needed only the truth. And now, they would carry it with them. Every time they saw a wedding planned by Aurora and Thorne. Every time someone complimented their own photos. Every time they remembered that the girl they dismissed was the woman who'd quietly orchestrated their perfection. I sat down on the edge of the table, the linen cool against my skin, and watched the lights from the house flicker behind the curtains. My body ached in the way only joy can cause exhaustion and peace mingling like old friends. The air smelled like lavender and lemon, and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe freedom. I thought about all the edits they'd made to me over the years, All the times they'd shortened my story so it would fit their narrative. All the times they rewrote my dreams as hobbies, my achievements as luck, my work as play. But tonight, I had rewritten it all. My wedding wasn't a rebellion. It was a declaration, a manifesto sewn in silk, a vow written in gold thread, a table of cakes that melted just enough to remind everyone that real things soften, shift, live. The next morning, there would be texts, some polite, some silent. A few maybe generous, but it wouldn't matter. I wasn't living in their edits anymore. I had the pen. And the story? It was just beginning. 3 days after the wedding, I opened my inbox to a message from a name I recognized immediately. Elise. Subject line, quick question. There was no greeting, just 2 sentences. Hey, would you mind sharing the name of your lighting vendor? They did an amazing job. Thinking about using them for a friend's event. No mention of the wedding itself. No congratulations. No acknowledgement of the months of backhanded comments or whispered laughter. Just a casual request, like we'd been exchanging tips all along. I stared at the email for a long time, not angry, not even surprised, just stunned by the smoothness of the pivot. Elise wasn't asking because she was curious. She was asking because something had shifted. She had felt the undercurrent, the difference between the weddings she used to plan with credit cards and Pinterest boards, and what she had seen on Saturday. She had felt the weight of intention, and she wanted in. Later that same day, Madeline reached out too. Hers came via Instagram, under the guise of a comment on a photo I'd posted of the garden at dusk. Seriously can't get over how beautiful everything looked. Let me know if you ever do consulting for smaller gatherings. The language was airy, informal, but I read between the lines. It wasn't flattery, it was positioning. By the end of the week, I had 3 new inquiries through my professional site, each routed through the public Aurora and Thorn landing page, each listing my region by name. One was from an acquaintance of Victoria's. Another was a former college peer who had once referred to me as a background character in the family. The third came from someone I didn't know at all, but who opened her message with, "I was at Camille's wedding, and I haven't stopped thinking about it." None of them knew they were stepping into something I had built with bare hands and calloused fingers. They only knew how it made them feel, and that was enough. I had never needed to advertise. Word of mouth, strategic referrals, and a deep commitment to exceeding expectations had kept my calendar full for years. But this was different. This was visibility. The kind that didn't come from exposure, but from reckoning. From people realizing they had misread the room and the woman who had designed it. That week, I updated my client list. Not the one in my CRM system, not the spreadsheet with invoices and dates and vendor contacts. My real client list. The one in my mind. The one that kept track not just of names, but of motives. Of who saw me clearly and who only looked when there was something to gain. I added Elise, not because she would ever become a real client, she wouldn't, but because her inquiry told me something. She had crossed the threshold from dismissal to interest, and that meant something had cracked. Madeline, too. I didn't respond to her message right away. I let it sit for 2 days. When I finally replied, I thanked her politely and said I was fully booked for the season, which was true. But I also knew she'd interpret that as scarcity, as prestige, and maybe, just maybe, that was what she needed to feel the absence of access. As for Victoria, she didn't reach out, not directly. But 2 weeks later, I noticed a new follower on our business page. No profile picture, a private account. But the name was familiar. Her assistant. The one who used to manage her RSVPs and gifts. The one who once scoffed at my suggestion of an eco-friendly catering vendor. That was how it always happened. They didn't apologize. They repositioned. They circled back quietly, pretending the past hadn't happened. But I remembered, and I kept receipts. The irony, of course, was that they were already on my list long before the wedding. Not as clients, as case studies. Examples of the kind of surface-level validation I had grown allergic to. Their weddings had been pretty, glossy, impressive in a way that faded once the photos were archived. Mine had been real, messy, alive, warm to the touch. I scrolled through photos from the day, stopping at one of Noah and me beneath the garden arch, hands tangled, cheeks pressed together. The sun was setting behind us, casting that kind of light photographers chase but rarely catch. In the background, out of focus, were the silhouettes of my cousins, seated at their table, watching. They hadn't smiled. They had stared. And I had felt it. Not as threat, but as confirmation. That moment was mine. That space mine. That story mine. I opened my calendar and added 3 new names to the next quarter referrals from guests, not influencers. Women who had whispered with wide eyes, "I want something like that." Brides who didn't care about the brand name, but about the feeling they left behind. The kind who didn't flinch when I told them we don't do packages. We do experiences. They said yes, they trusted me. Not because of a logo, but because they saw what it meant to rewrite the rules. And from then on, every time someone from that old circle came knocking, I would smile and nod and reply with grace. But I would always know. The first time they saw my work for what it was the day I stopped needing them to. I didn't even know the photo had been taken until weeks later. It wasn't in the official batch from the photographer I'd hired. Those came carefully edited, color-corrected, and curated with soft gradients and balanced shadows. No, this photo came from a guest, someone's sister or date, someone I barely remembered speaking to. It popped up in my tagged notifications one Tuesday morning, buried beneath a dozen messages and 2 vendor inquiries. No caption, just an image. At first glance, it looked like a candid, the kind people scroll past without noticing. But when I clicked, something caught in my chest. It was me. Standing at the edge of the garden, dress brushing against the grass, one hand gently resting on the back of a folding chair. I wasn't posing. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't aware of the camera. I was just watching off in the distance, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. My body was still, my posture calm, but there was something electric in the image. Not loud, not theatrical, just grounded. Like a tree that had finally realized it was taller than the roof it used to grow beneath. In the background, out of focus but unmistakable, were my cousins. Elise mid-laugh, her head tilted, caught between expressions. Madeleine, adjusting a strap on her dress, her brows slightly furrowed. Victoria, frozen in a half-turn, staring in my direction with her lips parted just slightly. And that was what did it. That expression. The half-second glimpse of realization that she didn't know the whole story anymore, that maybe she never had. The light in the photo was golden, the kind that wraps everything in softness, but the energy was sharp. Real. Not a fairy tale, not a revenge fantasy. Just truth, captured without warning. The woman in the foreground was no longer performing. She wasn't waiting to be noticed. She wasn't standing outside her own story. She was in it, entirely. I stared at that photo for a long time, letting the layers of it settle in my bones. This wasn't the glamorous shot of Noah and me under the arch. It wasn't the group photo with sparklers or the framed moment of our first dance. This wasn't the image anyone would expect to be their favorite, but it was mine, because it said everything without saying anything at all. This was what it looked like to outgrow the narrative you were assigned. This was what it looked like to stop explaining, stop performing, stop asking for a seat and start building your own table. This was what it looked like to own the company that designed their weddings while they still saw you as the girl who steamed their dresses. I saved the photo to my phone and later printed a copy small enough to slip into the drawer of my desk. Not to display, not to flaunt. Just to remind myself, on days when the world felt heavy or shallow or wrong, that there was a version of me who stood still in the face of everything she used to shrink from. I didn't post it. I didn't need the world to know. But I did email it to the photographer, asking if she could find the original and edit it as little as possible. I wanted the flaws intact. The uneven shadow across my shoulder, the wrinkled tablecloth in the corner, the way the hem of my dress had started to pick up dirt at the bottom. I wanted all of it, because perfection had never been the point. Presence was. Later that month, I got a call from a publication that had featured several Aurora and Thorn events before. They wanted to highlight my wedding in an article about unconventional planning and emerging voices in bridal design. I knew what they really meant. They meant scrappy, unbranded, viral-worthy without being too polished. They wanted to bottle what they didn't understand. They asked for images. I sent them the photo. The editor replied within the hour. "This one's powerful," she wrote. "There's something in it we don't usually see." I didn't reply. They'd see it soon enough, because the truth was, the photo didn't need explanation. It didn't need captions or hashtags or an accompanying quote about self-worth. It spoke in stillness. And it told a story louder than any toast, any headline, any whispered insult passed between cousins at a linen-covered table. It said, "I was never waiting for your approval." It said, "I built this without asking." It said, "I don't need to look at the camera to know I'm in the center of the frame." And most of all, it said the one thing I had waited years to believe fully. "You saw me now, but it was already too late."